I am Karen Ryan, the Carter Center's Senior Advisor for Human Rights and Special Representative on Women and Girls. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation at the Carter Center, Harmonizing Religion and Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've got a great program for you and only 75 minutes to get it all in. So I'm going to skip the long introductions. I hope you don't mind. The program has all of the details about our wonderful panelists, but I'll just tell you that on our far right, on my far right, your left, is Imam Omar Suleiman of the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. We welcome you. And next to him is the Rabbi Jill Jacobs of Trua, the Rabbinical Call for Human Rights. We welcome you. And the man next to me obviously needs no introduction, former President Jimmy Carter. Well, before I delve into the topics, let me remind you to silence your phone. I'm going to do it. I'm going to lead by example. Everything off. You are free to keep your phones out and tweet and share on social media during the conversation. And please use the hashtag Faith and Human Rights. You can also submit your questions for the panel via Twitter. Or if you're here in the audience with us, there will be cards handed out. And as long as you hand them to our staff by 7:40, they'll be collected cards, and we'll try to get in as many questions as we can toward the end of the program. So let's get started. 70 years ago, on December 10th, that's next Monday, the newly formed United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, inspired by texts of major world religions, recognizing the equal dignity of every human being. Tonight we will explore contemporary challenges for the universal pursuit of human rights through the lens of faith. Religious faith can be a source of solace and joy, motivating us to work for the betterment of ourselves, our families, our communities, and our nations, and the world at large. But religion has also become more polarized over the last 15 years, with extremist groups in many faiths becoming more emboldened. In our secular democracy, we treasure and protect the separation of church and state, but we cannot ignore the influence of religion and religious arguments and movements in our country and in the wider world. We will explore both personal faith as well as public expressions of our faith through commitments to improve our world. So I'm going to start with a question for our panelists on personal faith. If you could each please speak about the connection between your personal religious faith and your work on behalf of human rights. And I'd like to start with you, President Carter. If you could begin by reflecting on an idea that you addressed in your book. I'm not plugging, but yes I am. Faith, A Journey for All. It's a marvelous book. If you don't have it, you must get it. You address faith. What is faith in that book?
Well, I worship the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. I'm a Christian. And I wrote the book about faith because we have so many different kinds of prevailing faiths in our life. We have faith in ourselves, we have faith in each other, we have faith in things like democracy or freedom or human rights. We have faith in equality, we have faith in welcoming immigrants, we have faith in the basic principles of our country. We have faith in the combined teachings of all the major religions, Hebrewism and Christianity and others, Islam. And so I think that only one time in history have we ever gotten together as human beings and said, why don't we try to resolve the world's problems? And that was right after the Second World War, when 60 million people almost were killed. We had the horrible Holocaust that let the Nazis assassinate many Jews. I think it's about 6 million Jews. So in compensation for that and to prevent that happening again, we organized the United Nations to try to preserve peace, and we organized the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We wrote that 3 years later in order to make sure that everybody was treated equally. African Americans and white people, Jews and Christians and others. And we also tried to make equal rights between men and women, and equal rights, I would say, in the treatment by government of people who had a disparity in income. The poor protected from the very rich, and the people of color in imprisonment, things of all kinds. If you read the human rights, the 30 paragraphs in the Human Rights Declaration that was passed on the 10th of December, you'll see that it was basically designed to guarantee equality of treatment by one another and also by governments to compensate for disparities in treatment. So that's the essence of human rights, I think.
Thank you. Rabbi Jacobs.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to President Carter, and thank you to Karen for hosting this conversation here. It's really a privilege to be here. For me, my Judaism is what drives my commitment to work for human rights. I direct an organization, Truah, that mobilizes more than 2,000 rabbis in the US and Canada to work for human rights, to bring a moral rabbinic voice to human rights, both here at home and also in Israel and the occupied territories. And we do that out of the depth of our Judaism, out of the depth of our Jewish history and text and tradition. The very first thing that the Bible tells us about human beings is we're created in the image of God. That's the very first thing that we learn about ourselves. And that means that any injury to a human being is effectively an injury to God, and any attack on a human being is an assault on God. When the rabbis start talking about what this idea of Tselem Elohim, creation in the divine image, means, they, in the Talmud and other rabbinic literature, they have this idea that actually when you damage a human being, or God forbid, when you kill a human being, you're diminishing God in the world. And that's unfortunately what we're doing all the time in our world, in every place, in every moment. But it's not enough to say that we as human beings, as creations in the image of God, deserve not to be attacked, deserve to be treated the way that we would treat and respect God. We also have obligations, because it's very nice to say nothing bad should happen to me or to any of us, but somebody has to be responsible for making sure that that is true. And so Judaism has the idea of chiyuv, of obligation, which means that we have obligations both toward God and then also toward one another. And the rabbis, again, in later books of law, create whole systems of trying to figure out how to create a just society in which everybody has a decent chance of living a dignified and a successful life. A lot of times when people think about Jewish law, they think about ritual law, what you can eat, what you can't eat, what you do on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, what you don't do. But actually there's whole areas of Jewish law that deal with every single aspect of what we would now call human rights, whether it's the relationship between workers and employers, whether it's questions of criminal justice. All of these very live issues of human rights are debated and discussed, and there are many, many attempts to figure out how we can ensure that everybody lives in a just society. So that's the first piece for me. And then second, I want to say a word about history. Judaism has a very long, several thousands of years of history, which for us, we're always living in the present moment. History is not something that happened in the past. It's very much alive in my community. And in our history, of course, the core narrative of the Torah is a story of the oppression in Egypt, slavery in Egypt, and the liberation from slavery. And what's interesting about what happens after the Jewish people experience liberation is that God gives a series of laws, many of which have to do with interpersonal behavior, and some of which have to do with the responsibility toward the ger, toward the stranger, the sojourner, somebody who is not from our community but is living among us. It would be very easy to imagine a situation in which the people said, okay, we just got out of a situation of being oppressed by another people. We were strangers in this land, and so forget everybody else. We're just going to protect ourselves. But actually, that's the very moment that God says, no, now that you have experienced oppression, you have to be hyper aware of those who are vulnerable in your own community. And then finally, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as President Carter said, was one of the world's responses to the Holocaust and to World War II. And it was the world's attempt at saying that what happened to my community, what happened to others, shouldn't happen again. This is aspirational. We have not yet fulfilled the hopes of that declaration. But it really is a sacred document. It's the world coming together and saying, this is what we aspire to, this is what we hope that every nation will live up to. And for my organization in particular, we look to that declaration as a core Jewish document of our time, a modern Jewish text, because it was in large part a response to our own tragic experience, and because the experience of our history tells us that that history now imposes obligations that we have to take that document forward.
Thank you, Rabbi. Imam Omar.
So, I mean, with the personal story in particular, a lot of my work reflects in my own personal journey and trying to struggle not just with faith, but with overall identity. The institute, that Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, focuses on inspiring contribution through conviction. It sort of pushes back on this idea that the more devout you are as a Muslim, the more dangerous you are to your society. But more in the Quranic conception, which is that the more devout you are as a Muslim, the more beneficial you are to humanity. And that a conflicted American Muslim identity isn't good for anybody. And a lot of times as we struggle, and I think we'll get to our political polarization, there's this idea that we have to accept either a certain definition of American to be American Muslims, a very narrow definition which sets a different threshold for patriotism for us as American Muslims, or that M on Muslim has to be lowercase. So you got to relinquish a part of your identity because society has derived certain conclusions about Islam on the basis of hate mongering and on the basis of a very targeted campaign that's been particularly vicious after 9/11. So you have to accept those conclusions and relinquish those elements of your faith rather than stick to them. Growing up, it was conflict our entire lives. My parents were both uprooted. They were from Palestine. My mother and father actually met at U of H at the University of Houston, so they both had their journeys to Texas, where I live right now, but I'm not a Texan. I'll get to that in a moment. Just as a qualification there. My parents met at U of H. They both had very unique journeys, but they both really had to fight and to struggle to exist because they had no homeland, or their homeland was taken from them. They had no family to connect to. They had no one to support them in their education. My dad literally had the story of showing up on a bus in Houston and getting a graveyard shift at 7-Eleven, not speaking a word of English. And now he's a distinguished professor in chemistry at a HBCU. And they embodied struggle and being able to overcome any obstacle. And then my mother, may God have mercy on her soul, struggled with a lot of personal issues in terms of health, cancer and the likes. And I saw faith power them through that. And not only did it power them through their unique struggles, it made them more loving to each other, it made them more loving to us, and it made them better people to humanity. And so they were able to overcome any struggle or obstacle that came their way. So the personal side of this, growing up, we had a story of struggle. We had a story of witnessing, my dad threw David Duke out of a mosque way back then. It's nice to see him resurface to relevance, but that's another story maybe we get to later on. We had a story of our parents giving away our car to Somali refugees, coming home and finding refugees from Bosnia, wielding a hammer for Habitats for Humanity. That was our story growing up. And what that speaks to in the faith, in particular in Islam, which sort of ties my work in conviction and contribution, is that God describes faith as a tree in the Quran. And he says that its roots are firm and its branches are high in the sky, and it's in constant production of fruit. What that means is that if faith is rooted deeply in the heart, the greater awareness you have of God, the greater awareness you have of the humanity that's around you. And if you are, in the Quran, if you're standing, there are verses about standing up and praying at night. Every time God talks about prayer at night, he immediately connects it to charity in the day. And what that speaks to is that if you're paying attention to God when other people are not, then you're paying attention to people when other people are not. And your branches being high in the sky provide shade to humanity. What drew me to that was that constant connection, the coherence of understanding the oneness of God and the oneness of humanity, the fullness of the Abrahamic tradition in that sense. God describes the prophet Abraham, peace be upon him, in the Quran as a nation of good, that it was as if he was a nation because of the good that came out of that one man. God describes Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, in the Quran, or quotes him rather, وَجَعَلَنِي مُبَارَكًا أَيْنَمَا كُنْتَ, that he made me blessed wherever I may be, and that he carried with him goodness wherever he was. He changed and transformed wherever he was. And finally, the description of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as rahmatan lil alameen, as a mercy to all of the worlds. And so what drew me to that was that constant connection being made, and Islam having a very explicit anti-racism tradition that drew in the Malcolm X's of the world. I did a class on the 40 hadiths, 40 sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on social justice. And when I covered things like environmental justice or animal rights or human rights or whatever it may be, I never had to struggle to find an explicit text. If anything, I had to narrow it down because it was so explicit, it is so explicit in the divine revelation that everything around you is assigned a God-given presence. And it's not even spoken about in terms of rights, but a God-given sanctity. And you have to honor that which God honored.
Thank you so much. Those were beautiful reflections. Yeah, beautiful from both of you, from all three of you.